We're starting now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to Dragon Tail Books in our environmental series. So this is the fourth in our series. So the rest you can see on YouTube, and we're recording this one as well. So afterwards you can follow up. And so today we have Heather Wood and Chase Cummings from Dunn County, and they did well testing in the summer, and so they're going to give us a lowdown on what they found in our water. All right. And can people ask questions during, like, or would you like them to hold?
We'll kind of bounce around, so I guess I'm open to, if there's any questions that really strike you, go ahead and let them loose. Otherwise, we made some space at the end for questions as well.
Okay. All right. Just want to know if people, because sometimes it's like, oh, the thought is there. So thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everyone. As Ann said, my name is Chase Cummings. I'm the County Conservationist with Dunn County Land and Water Conservation Division. We're a division of Environmental Services Department within the county. So county surveyor, planning and zoning, or planning and land use are two other divisions that we share an office space with. There's been a partnership that's been developed over the years with Dunn County Public Health as well. So tonight we'll cover a little bit about some of the history of groundwater monitoring within the county, but particularly regarding a project that we worked on this past year through the use of ARPA funds, or American Rescue Plan Act funds. While I'm the supervisor of the department, I really don't do anything but move chess pieces around, and the people to my left, Heather Wood, really took the lead of this project and made it happen, established a plan. We basically gave her a budget and she ran with it, and we were quite successful. We also had an opportunity to hire a summer intern through a cooperation with the Dunn County Alliance of Conservation Sports Clubs. We were able to, fortunately, to hire a Stout student close to home, a local student, Hunter Larson, who happens to be here today too. We'll throw him under the bus later on a few of the hiccups in the program, but no, I'm just kidding. We couldn't have did it without him either. Heather will get into some of the details, and so we'll go through the whole program and give you the information and the results, and then I'll be here, and Heather and I and Hunter will be here to answer questions, and we hope to kind of get into some of what the results say, but then also just the experience of collecting almost 1,000 samples within the community. So with that, I'll let Heather run with it.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Heather Wood, Water Resources Specialist for the same division. Chase kind of mentioned, but here's kind of what to expect tonight. A little bit of background as to what actually led up to this study. There's been a decent amount of work done in the background. Started probably 2015, 2018, so we'll cover some of that stuff. And then I'll go over just an overview of what we did for the program this past year, as well as some of the results. I will forewarn, I will not get into all of the weeds on everything we tested for, just because there is not enough time on the planet for that. There is the full report available, so that does have all the results in it, but we're going to kind of cover the highlight reel of the results tonight. And then a little bit looking forward with what we're planning with the leftover funds from last year's program. So getting into the history, most of this starts from our end of things in 2018 with an ad hoc committee from the county board. It was a partnership between Land and Water Conservation, the health department, county board supervisors, community members, and a whole slew of people that kind of came together and wrote this action plan that predates either of our time with Dunn County. And you can't really see it super clearly here, but this was the highlights of the action plan that they came up with. And it was measurable goals and objectives for this ad hoc committee, and things that we can take at Land and Water and Public Health and kind of use to inform different things that we're doing and what we're trying to target as far as groundwater concerns across the county go. And then in 2019, this kind of started up some sampling efforts. Now, this sampling effort is similar to what we did this past year, but significantly smaller. And it was called an EPHT study, which is Environmental Public Health
Tracking grant.
There it is. And that was applied for through the folks down in Public Health. And that was where the partnership really came into play. It was consisted of two phases. The first phase was 75 folks down in the southeastern corner of the county. And they selected that area because that area is known to have a higher risk for high nitrates. And so the first phase, they went out, they collected those, and they just tested for nitrates and bacteria. And then the second phase, they went through the initial 75, and there were 25 that were above the health standard. So they asked those 25 people if they would let them come back out and retest for a variety of different compounds, ranging from septic tracers, we call them tracer compounds, to ag tracers. I believe they tested for a dozen ag compounds and 5, can't remember, 5? I can never remember, it's 5 and 12. 8, it's right there, 5 ag compounds and 12 septic compounds. The numbers get all mixed up in my head. In those results, they did find some, unsurprisingly, ag compounds. They found a total of 3 different ag compounds actually had detectable amounts, but they also found 2 of the septic compounds. And these are things like sucralose, aspartame, fake sugars are the most common, caffeine metabolites, those are the sorts of things. So we know that they're most likely coming from septic systems. There could be an argument made that it could be coming from municipal sludge, but in these areas, it's predominantly going to be septic systems. So this whole thing happened, and then 2020 happened, and there was kind of a lull. The 2019 EPHT program was a partnership with public health, and then 2020 happened. And I don't know if anybody remembers, there was a thing happening in 2020 that kind of shut down the world. And so our friends in public health had to shift all of their workload into the COVID thing, which kind of led to a bit of a lull. It also led into a little bit of a staff turnover, and COVID and staff turnover were 2 different things. My predecessor just got a different opportunity, and so she took it. I come in somewhere in the middle of 2020. So there was a bit of a lull and not a lot was happening, but in 2020, we managed to get the final reporting done for the EPHT grant. And then I started to kind of get my footing and figuring out where we're going, what are we doing. I learned about the groundwater ad hoc committee because I come from the private sector, so I didn't know what was going on in Dunn County. And then in 2021, we took some of the stuff from that groundwater ad hoc committee recommendations and worked with the folks in land information, and they gave us this nifty online groundwater quality viewer, and it's really interactive. It's live now, so anybody who wants to can go and check it out. You zoom in and you can view down to the section level what the average data looks like down in that area. And all of the data from the most recent study has been added to this, but it also consists of data going as far back as 1985. We have stuff that's come in from different efforts that were taking place in Colfax, and anybody who sends me just random well tests, as long as it's from a certified lab, I'll work with land information and we get that put into the database. So we have a pretty large database on the county website that anybody can look at whenever they want. And it gives you averages. It won't give individual test results or anything like that. And then 2022, the committee came to Chase and said, hey, American Rescue Plan Act funding, we think this is a chance for us to maybe get some sort of something. What do you guys think you can do? And so he and I sat down and we put together 3 different proposals, and you can't really see it very clearly, but we had 3 different proposals with 3 different scales. One was fairly small, and then one was the largest one. It was 1,000 samples and all that. And of course, our committee decided to go with the largest option. At one point, one of the supervisors asked us, do you think you can actually get this done? And we said, well, I mean, I told her straight up, it's stupidly ambitious, but I wouldn't put it to paper if we couldn't do it. And so they said, okay, then go forth. So they sent that to the full county board, and the full county board liked it enough to give us the money. And so off we went, and then I spent the entirety of 2022 planning, working with labs, mapping things out, getting a whole bunch of help from a lot of different folks in IT, as well as the Healthy Environmental Action Team. I think that's the acronym, which is a division of Health Done Right. they have some folks in public health, and they actually put together a really awesome mailer for us that went out to basically everyone in the county. And then I spent the month of December in 2022 as a call center, taking signups for this program. So that brings us to last year. So this was the quick summary of what we did last year. We kind of went into this with two main goals. We wanted to get just a point in time summary of quality controlled data. So what I mean by quality controlled is that there's a lot of folks who don't know that their water is tested, and so we were asking folks. We were having staff go out and collect the samples. Interns going out to collect the samples. And so they would run the water, they know how to collect it. So we have a little bit of control there. We're not grabbing softened samples or stuff run through reverse osmosis systems. So that way we're actually getting what the groundwater looks like before any sort of treatment happens to it. And then education and outreach. So you can't fix a problem you don't know if you have it. And that was kind of one of the main things. There's some resources available and people don't know about them. So there's a whole variety of resources and information that we just wanted to get out into the community and get into folks' hands so they can actually use that information. We had a little over 1,000 people sign up, and there was a bit of a lag between the times that we had signups and actually getting out to sample. So in that time, there were people who moved or decided they didn't want us there anymore. There was a few people who forgot that they signed up, and one who was particularly displeased that he had signed up. I'm confused, honestly. But in the end, we ended up testing 973 private wells, as well as getting representative samples from all of the 22 unincorporated townships within Dunn County. And this just kind of gives you an idea of what the distribution was across the county. Unsurprisingly, the 3 townships closest to the city had the highest sign-up numbers, but that makes sense. They're the most populous towns by a long shot. Flip side of that, we also had a lot of our less populous towns have quite a few sign-ups. Peru is the one that always sticks out to me because we had 27 sign-ups there, which is about 11% of their total population. So you figure not everybody's living by themselves, so we probably got a hefty swath of the private well users down in that part of the county. So that was a little bit surprising, but pleasantly so. So then the other part of this program that I'll talk about a little bit is the town hall sampling. So we had it broken down into 2 different phases. So we had the town hall sampling, which I did in January of 2023. I spent 2 days, hopped in the truck, and went around to all the town halls. We did 17 town halls, and then 5 of those were proxies. And by proxies, I mean the town halls either, in the case of O'Galley, didn't exist. Peru and Otter Creek, their town halls don't have wells. And then both Red Cedar and Dunn are on municipal systems, which kind of defeats the purpose of what we're looking for here. So all of those had proxy sites within the county. We were able to get those samples. We did the same testing for the town halls that we did for all of the private wells, but we added on the PFAS testing. To do it for all of the private wells across the county would have been completely cost prohibitive, and we would have had to do probably only about 200 private wells for the whole program. And so this seemed like a better way to get just a baseline idea of what PFAS look like in the groundwater across the county. Spatially distributed, so we can kind of see, is there anything that we really need to be aware of, putting more resources into, and that. And then the private well sampling, we started in late May, and then spent all of June doing that. And then, so it was 6 weeks for the initial batch of testing, and then our lovely intern spent 2 weeks in July going through and contacting and touching base with everyone who we missed on that initial sweep through the county to try and pick up as many as we could. There were some that just fell off, but we still managed to get 973, so that's nothing to shake a stick at. So now we'll start getting into some of the results. And with the town hall testing, I'm just going to touch on the PFAS because the comprehensive stuff doesn't really tell us a whole lot. It got worked into the county database, but it's one point in time. And the reason I don't go too deeply into it is, it doesn't really tell us much. It can skew things a little bit. The best example is that Rock Creek, which has pretty high nitrates, actually didn't have any detect at their town hall. So from the town hall PFAS end of things, we tested for 33 different compounds. 18 of them have health standards that are set by EPA or DHS. And across the county, most of the town halls had detectable levels, which is not what anybody really wants to hear. As we get more into this and as the science around PFAS develops, we learn that it's unfortunately kind of ubiquitous across the country. There was no neat and tidy distribution as to the where or the why, but they were everywhere. 14 of the 22 town halls did have detectable levels of some PFAS compounds. The only silver lining there is that none of them were at or above current health standards, which right now, the EPA has those set at 70 parts per trillion. There is a push to set them lower at 4. Thankfully, even if we look at it from the lower standard, none of our town halls exceeded that. There was one that came kind of close, but they're all under it. So silver lining in a not so bright moment.
Heather?
Yeah.
I can't read what the green and what the yellow
Oh,
are.
sorry. The yellow is present and the green is absent. And I just did a straight present absent because the concentrations get all kinds of weird.
Thank you.
But yeah, so all of that yellow is, there was detectable levels of 1 or more of the compounds. And when we're looking at PFAS, we look at them cumulatively for the health impacts. So the health standards evaluate up to 4 parts per trillion of all of them that are detected, of the 18 that have those health standards. So 0.1, 0.2, et cetera, et cetera. You add it up, and as long as you're below 4 with the new proposed limits, then it's considered safe to consume. Nitrates is the next thing, and so this is just the private well data. This does not include the town hall data, simply because the way nitrates act in the system, you're going to get different readings in January than you will in June, typically speaking. So we didn't want to skew anything. And this is just kind of the county-wide distribution. The green is lower, the red is higher. Thankfully, none of them had an average that were above the health standards, but this is on a fairly wide spatial area. The highest sample that we had tested for 40.4 milligrams per liter, which is wildly high, and actually is higher than the highest in the EPHT grant, which was just these 4 townships. And so that, again, not good, but it could be seasonal variations, it could be, different well, it could be any number of factors. Across the county, we averaged about 4.42, which is well below the health standard. 10 is the established range for when you need to be concerned. And then about 12% were above that 10 milligrams per liter concentration of health standard. Again, not great, but on par with the state. And then that's just a link to the county well water viewer that I mentioned earlier. And then this is my preferred method of viewing anything in a natural system. So we have those averages across the towns, and that tells us 1 or 2 things. But natural systems don't listen to political boundaries. So this is, I call it a heat map. And you'll notice the disclaimers. This is not a forecasting map. This is not saying that if you put a well right here, you're gonna be above health standards. It's saying if we took all of that data that we collected, the 973 that were collected last summer, and we kind of do some math in the background, we can model out what a surface would look like with those samples. It's important to note that this is just one model. I like using this model just because it does account for some variability, but the wells that we're sampling, this is a 2D model of a 3D system. What I mean by that is you have the north, south, east, west. It doesn't account for depth. And so we had Hunter start going through some of the well records of the folks that did do the sampling to figure out what the depth was of the well casing, and to see where to try and get some of that third dimension. But that's a lot of work, and not every well has a well drilling report. So we don't have that third dimension for everything. And in order to get a full 3D model, that takes so much more time than we currently have put into this and work. And honestly, across a county, I don't know that it would really be feasible with the current methods that we have. So nitrates in groundwater. This is just gonna kind of go through a quick, what causes it? Which is there's a lot of things. This is not an all-inclusive list. This is just a focus on the main things. We know from people far more intelligent than I am, about 90% of the nitrates in groundwater in this state come from agricultural land uses. And that's not to say that right now what's happening is the 90%, it's cumulative. Some of what's happening now, some of what happened in 1985, and so on and so forth. So the best thing we can do is mitigate it by land use. And that's where a lot of the other work that we do in land and water conservation comes into play. Nutrient management planning, all kinds of things like that that can help offset some of this stuff. Now, in the last map, there was the big heat hotspot down here, and unsurprisingly, it is heavy use ag, and the soils down there are really sandy, and so you see all of these things start to add up that just make the nitrates get into the groundwater system a whole lot easier. We have, heavy irrigated ag down there and sandy soils, so there's not really much of anything to hold on to the nitrates that allow it to get straight into the water table. Flip side, septic systems do contribute. This isn't to say that, it's one or the other. It really depends on what's going on in your individual well. We can say 90% of the nitrates come from ag, but I can't say, I live in a more urban area, I have a private well. Odds are good if I had high nitrates, it would most likely be caused by septic. So really, on an individual basis, you need to stand at your wellhead and look around. What's going on? And so on a population level, we can say these things are patterns, but when you're looking at individual cases, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. Arsenic was another thing that we noticed some weirdness on with this study. So again, this model, just like the nitrate map, it's just one model. It's just a general pattern of what we noticed from this one point in time data. And so the red is above the limit of detection and the blue is below it. The limit of detection is 0.005 for the lab that we went through, and the limit of quantitation is 0.01, which inconveniently enough is also the health standard. So anything in between that 0.005 limit of detection and 0.01 limit of quantitation is kind of a fuzzy reading, and so you need to get it retested to have a more certain concentration rating. So when I'm looking at this, I just looked at people who had detectable levels of arsenic. It's one of those things where the more you have, the bigger your problem is. And none of these are to the level of, like, say, rat poison or anything like that. It's not at levels that are just going to cause immediate harm, but it is at levels that can be concerning. So the unsettling part is that it comes from bedrock. This isn't something where it's land use. This isn't something where, people are putting things on the land or doing things. It's just there. And so this goes back to kind of that education and outreach part. You can't do anything if you don't know that you have the problem. So we did give people resources for DNR programs. At the county level, we don't have the resources to get people their reverse osmosis systems or drill new wells or anything like that. But we do have the resources to connect with state resources that can then get out and help folks. And we actually did have one or two folks from this program touch base with our DNR contact, and he said that they were actually getting grants to get this fixed. So that was, a silver lining with kind of unsettling trends. The other thing that was weird about this is that we were expecting it to be in this northeastern corner, just because that's the way the geology is, and from the statewide overview that Wisconsin Geological Society has done, this is where the bedrock is that would conventionally have higher arsenic, but that wasn't the case. We didn't have any detects up there. So this is one of those things where, in order to make any sort of definitive sweeping conclusion about anything, we would really need to do a lot more digging and a lot more sampling. All right, so this is just some bullet points about some additional information. We tested for a total of 20 different things in the private well sampling effort. It was 53 things if you include the PFAS for the town hall. There's a lot of really good information through UW Stevens Point. They're kind of known as the groundwater hub of the state. So if you're looking for just general information there, our well water viewer is actually modeled for the statewide one that they have. So that's an awesome resource. Otherwise, the full report for this project is available on the county website at either the Land and Water Conservation page or the groundwater specific page. It's about 30 pages full of numbers and facts and figures. It's absolutely riveting of a read. Looking ahead for our 2024 sampling program, the dinosaur QR code is not just there for fun. It will take anybody who is interested to the sign-up form for this year's sampling program. It's a lot more scaled back this year. We are looking to collect 240 samples, and we do plan on recollecting all the town halls and their proxies. And we're going to keep it a little more local with our lab this year. It was nothing that the Stevens Point lab did wrong. They just aren't local, and it is a lot more convenient when you don't have supplies to have to zip over to Eau Claire than to have to go to Stevens Point. And so this year we will be testing for nitrates and metals. The nitrates because that is kind of our known problem, and the metals because arsenic was weird. So we can see what we can see there. Signups are now open. Online, call me, email me. I will get folks on the list. Share with your friends and neighbors. And we will be getting started sampling after July 4th. Part of the reason we do it during the summer is because then we have an intern who can do things, and we can ship them out into the wild and get them the lovely experience of interacting with the public with no adults there to help them. I'm just kidding, they are adults. All right. And that is all I've got for you. So if there's any questions, we're ready.
I would just add a few things too that, Heather mentioned the goals of the program was primarily for education. This was a free service to the public, so it was about $168, I think it was, for so around $170 test that was provided. There were several people that had tested their water before, but a lot of people had never tested their water before. So being able to provide information to them by, okay, here's what you need to look for and what you need to consider. The other goal was, basically just to try to start establishing a little bit better data set for the county, trying to help establish a process where in the future, when we obtain more funds or have the privilege to obtain more funds, just test again, we can start looking at trend analysis across the county. We have data in that well water viewer from 1985. You can click, like Heather said, click right down to the section and see how many samples were collected. But it's really hard to say, like, what is our groundwater doing? Are we improving? Is it getting better? Getting worse? All of that to say that helps inform land use decisions in the future. Right now, this program and the data that we have, it's very hard to say, that we need to work, especially in certain areas of the county. Like we look at the map of the heat map, where it looks like maybe we have higher nitrate concentrations. We certainly, that's not unexpected, based on the land use. And we know that we need to put our land and water conservation efforts in those areas to look at nutrient management planning and think about how we might manage the land a little bit differently. But it's really hard to say, or develop a strong policy against saying, well, we really shouldn't put a development there, or you really shouldn't drill a well there. We're just not in a position to do that yet. So all of this data is with caution. Heather mentioned this several times about how unique this is to each individual well. There's been some work, analysis done with the town of Colfax. I've had some exposure. I worked in Pepin County before coming to Dunn County, and some data in townships down there as well, where you look at the look at well construction reports, look at the casing depth and the depth to the static water level at the top of the water table. And however deep that casing goes into the water, the deeper the better. And it hits actually around 50 to 60 feet of casing into the water table where your nitrate concentration drops off. So it's information like that that we can talk specifically with a well owner or a new homeowner who wants to drill a new well. There's things that they can consider. But Heather mentioned too, like this is one point in time that a lot of this data is. She mentioned seasonality. You know, winter's going to come around. You know, this winter is unique, but you know, with the changes of the season, the changes in water table concentrations, nutrient concentrations are also expected. So we feel like the goals of the program were met, and there were a ton of ancillary opportunities too. So Heather did most of the work. Hunter did probably just as much, if not more, of the collection than Heather. But we also had every single one of our Land and Water Conservation Division staff go out and at least spend 2 days collecting samples. And I wanted to do that because that helps us get out in the community, puts a face with our department, helps give our staff experience. But we were able to see every socioeconomic status within the county. Is a good experience to really understand what Dunn County is working with and what we have to offer. And then there's, you know, we joke, but we really should write a book about this because the experiences that we all had interacting with the community members was things to remember. So I guess
Better or worse.
for better or worse, yeah.
So
but
can
with-
we have story time now?
Right. That's why we brought Hunter.
Floor's all yours.
No, we think it's a very, very good program, and your support in the community for projects like this in the future is appreciated. And we're hoping to do this on a routine basis in the future so we can keep building this data set and we can help it inform more land use decisions, both at the township level and the county level. So I guess with that, we're ready for rapid fire questions.
I have a simple one for you. So for our new wells, because we drilled a well, God, I don't know, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And I remember there was some paperwork we had to go through with our well driller and send stuff into the county. So what happens now in terms of the data that you collect from every new well? And are the requirements changing from that, or what are you doing? What are you learning from that, and what do you require now?
Yeah, so certainly the county, through the county health department, they require a permit and you know, information to be turned in and kind of some oversight on that location, making sure the siting of the well is appropriate. Legislature rules kind of change in the last 5 years about any time that a certified well driller or plumber accesses a well, bacteria and nitrate sample is supposed to be pulled. So we drill a new well now, for sure, that data is being collected. In the past, it wasn't required, but now it's required. And that goes into a state database. The well water quality viewer that Stevens Point has is working on trying to mine that data back into a central location. So in the future, we hope to have a central spot where any person can go and click on and find out kind of what the data is. But it is being collected, it is being analyzed. We don't necessarily have direct access at the county level yet. So that's why Heather mentioned, you know, we would encourage if you do collect water samples outside of our programming, you can send it into Heather and we can get it entered into our database so that locally we can have the most, you know, current and accurate.
Does it go to the state public health? That's
Yeah.
where it goes?
Yep, and it goes into the groundwater retrieval network, which is typically through the state lab of hygiene.
I live in the red zone, not a good thing. Not just application of fertilizer, it's the factory farm and the manure spreading, which has really caused our nitrates to go up. So I'm curious, do you see any interest or movement from the DNR or the Department of Ag to actually use this data that you've collected to make some of their decisions about how much manure they allow to be spread and how often.
So I guess I can comment a little bit. One of the things that's really important to remember when talking to us or DNR staff or anything like that is that as much as we would want to do things, we may want to do things differently, we have to act within the confines of the laws that the legislature sets forth for us. And so there are laws, the most prevalent being NR 151. Down in the southeastern part, they would also be considered affected by 243, which is the law that governs concentrated CAFOs, large-scale factory farming, and what have you. And there are more laws that and regulations around CAFO farms, but we can only do so much within the confines of those laws. Now, there's definitely things like nutrient management planning and land use that we can do things on, but at the end of the day, the decisions aren't always ours to make, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so to maybe Heather's being, I can be more direct in saying that no, I don't think the state has an opportunity to use our data to help more local decision making on that permit front. Similar to what Heather was implying is that the rules that are in place would take an active legislature to change. And the specific ones that pertain to nutrient application would come through basically looking at nitrogen recommendations for crops. Right now, nitrogen recommendations for growing crops are based on a maximum return to nitrogen. So that looks at economics and the soil type of crop, and research that's done to kind of balance all that out. So there's a point at where of diminishing return of like you can put on so much nitrogen and eventually the curve is going to plateau and you're not going to get any more yield out of that. So landowners, farmers that are applying nitrogen, that's money that they're wasting. So in general, they're not trying to spend more money on particularly commercial fertilizer than they have to. Now, when it comes to manure, certainly there's large quantities that has to go somewhere. Though right now, the way it's set up, it's based on soil type, crop type, and a nutrient management plan that balances all of that. And certainly there's an argument to be made that whether or not the rules that we have in place are environmental standards or economic standards. And until rules and legislation is changed, like Heather said, we're confined to work within those boundaries that we have. So there is potential for more local control in certain areas to a limit. The state legislature has also limited that. So talk about Rock Creek Township. They're an unzoned town. Would zoning help them, county zoning program help them to manage their land in a better way? Potentially. But when it comes to large scale livestock operations, when it comes to any livestock operation over 500 animal units, the state has laws in place that say this is how, you're confined to this particular process. So all of that to say that the nutrient management plan that we required through a livestock siting ordinance is the same nutrient management plan that we require right now through our countywide ag performance standard ordinance. And unfortunately, we have to offer cost share on certain things in order to get compliance based on when that field was in existence. So basically, it's in existence as of October of 2002. If you have a field that was farmed or a farm that was in existence prior to that date, in order for us to achieve compliance with today's standards, we have to provide them a bona fide offer of cost share. And we don't have enough money to go around to do that. So now we're trying to build relationships and help people try to make those changes on their own and look for other sources of funding to help make that happen. But we can't just enforce compliance through citations or corporation counsel without making an offer of cost share first. So our confines are pretty narrow when it comes to what we can and can't do, unfortunately.
On the brighter side of things, we do get creative with the funding sources we have. We've got, 5 or 6 different funding sources that we've been using in ways that the DNR goes, I need to make sure that's okay, but I don't see why not. And that's with support from them. They enjoy that, but it's just, we're doing what we can with what we have.
I'm new to learning about water and like the contaminants. Can you say more about what nitrogen like the hazards of nitrogen in water?
Yeah, so with nitrates, nitrogen is a little bit weird. You know, when we say arsenic, you don't want any because that is bad. Nitrates are something that our bodies actually need to survive. It does a bunch of metabolic processes internally. But you get that point of no return where it's just no longer good. I mean, nobody's going to say, like, stop eating celery, it's high in nitrates. But they might tell you to curb the deli meats. Now, when you have too much, the most commonly known problem with that is blue baby syndrome. And so nitrate, it does some stuff in the bloodstream and it binds to oxygen. And in little kids, that can be deadly, essentially suffocation. But in adults, there's a lot more mass. And so we don't have that same problem. The flip side is there are other problems. It's been linked to certain levels of certain types of like thyroid disease and a few different types of cancer. So it's not good.
And that's particularly related to long-term exposure to above that 10 parts per million health standard. Natural background levels, and typically in Wisconsin groundwater, is 1 or 2 parts per million nitrate in groundwater. So anything above that, is considered elevated or human-induced based on land use. And long-term exposure is being linked to more and more things. Nitrate too itself, the molecule itself, is a negatively charged ion, which in soil is negatively charged too. So when you talk about like phosphorus, for example, phosphorus actually has a positive charge. So when it gets in the soil, it binds to the soil typically in most scenarios, and it doesn't leach out. Nitrogen in ammonia form or ammonium form, that also binds to the soil, but as that goes through the nitrogen cycle, it converts to nitrate, and if you don't have a root there to take it up, that's when it leaches past the root zone and then gets into the water table. There's a lot of discussion about this nitrate contamination that we're seeing is from my grandpa when they didn't know how to manage nitrogen. And the facts really is there are zones of contribution that can be calculated based on soil type, well depth, casing depth, and it can be as early as 2 years to as long as 25, 30, 40 years. So it all is site specific, and the time of travel to get to that well is very site specific. So it may be my grandpa's nitrogen that we're drinking, but it could be the nitrogen we applied last year too.
So how persistent is elevated levels of nitrates? So if you have an elevated level of nitrate in areas, how persistent is that? I mean, if you just turned off the ag on that area.
Yep.
Of course, you have to know what the aquifer is doing.
Yeah, right. You need to know flow direction and land use, upstream land use. You need to know, pumping rates. There's all kinds of other variables that are in that area. I mean, you could see immediate, effects if it's a very localized thing. And honestly, it could be you may have a sand point well, and you just stop applying lawn fertilizer, you could see an impact. But when you get into more depth of wells, typical homeowner wells, and we're talking, longer term, and in some cases, we're even looking at, based on the land use that we have, can we just maintain a nitrate level and not even, while we try to be optimistic, not even think about trying to lower it in some cases, but can we just keep it at a steady state?
Because the mitigation is really filtration at the surface level.
Right.
That's what you can do.
Yeah. And, agriculture is a leaky system, right? It can rain after the day after you put nitrogen down, and it's gone. And then they have to reapply. Septic drain fields are a leaky system. They do not treat for nitrate. So if anything that's coming through your body and going through your septic system, it's not necessarily all of it is staying in your septic tank. It's being put out into the effluent field, which then leaches down through, and that's why it could be a septic source as well. So.
And to kind of add on to that, some of our colleagues in neighboring counties most counties nearby have done some form of groundwater work. We've all done things a little bit differently. But one of our colleagues, I think it was St. Croix County, they've done a lot of repeat testing on the same wells, and they found that with some of those wells, it's not abnormal to see a fluctuation in either direction of about 2 parts per million, just based on seasonality. Chase kind of mentioned, nitrate hangs out with water, and so when water's flowing, it'll flow. So right now, I wouldn't be surprised if folks who had elevated nitrates are seeing a little bit lower just because of how dry it's been the past 6 to 8 months.
I'm curious about in some of the big ag areas there's so much center pivot irrigation. How much does that, especially in sandy areas like where we live, how much does that affect the nitrate levels? And is there any control that can be had over the use of the irrigation, like
So as far
a
as
nighttime visit to the well with some bentonite? No, I didn't.
yeah, so every high capacity well, so that's what typically an irrigation well is defined as a high capacity well. They are required to have a permit, they're required to report every year to the state their use and the quantity. So right now, I'm not aware of any particular situation, at least locally in Dunn County, where the DNR would come out and say, you can't use this well because you're pumping too much water. It's an interesting, it's a wicked problem, right? And part of that is when we talk about managing nitrogen, traditionally in agriculture, we would put all the nitrogen we need up front when we planted the crop or within a few weeks of planting the crop. And keep your fingers crossed that we didn't get a big soaker rain and that nitrogen could carry that crop through to the end. For the longest time then is promoting spoon feeding, like can we put nitrogen out there when that crop needs it at the right place, right rate, right time. And irrigation can provide that by fertigation, putting nitrogen through the center pivot irrigation when it's needed. Now there's also some concern with backflow prevention, and you hook a tank up to a well or pipes, and if things fail, it could go down the well, and there's a lot of precautions there too. So it's kind of this tricky situation where we want to promote not front loading nitrogen to get a yield, but we want to promote spoon feeding it, and irrigation does provide that aspect of it. Now, Heather manages some wells in the county as far as quantity and depth through a well intel sensor program. And as you would expect, when it dries up, we see a drop in the water table. But what happens then too is we have irrigation that turns on. So it's exponential then, that impacts that water table. So, it could be argued that providing irrigation water to a crop keeps it healthy, keeps it, absorbing nutrients, keeps it alive. But then it's also making sure that we're monitoring it and accrediting the nitrogen that's going through it. Now, the other thing that's really starting to take hold and more of a conversation, especially in the central sands part of the state, which it will come here to, is crediting your groundwater for nitrogen concentration. So we have this data. Farms can then now go and they can sample their high cap well, and before they turn that irrigator on, they can calculate the amount of nitrogen that's coming through that water just because it's already has elevated levels in it, and factor that into your nutrient management plan. So you don't need to, you might be able to save another 10 pounds of nitrogen because it's already in the water. So that could affect in time, cycling that water through, but it's just, there's so many variables and so many things, it's really hard to really pin down
So is the DNR only managing for volume of water then?
Right now, that's, yep. So when they permit a well, so this has gone back and forth through the courts too, but it's settled for now that they can consider cumulative effect when you drill a new high cap well. So cumulative effect meaning how many other wells are around it, are there surface waters that could be impacted around it, and then whether or not that well could be permitted in the first place. But it's primarily quantity right now.
So how do you determine if, I'm thinking of our ponds, all of a sudden creasers put in 13 high cap wells above our place, and of course it's droughty, so it's hard to know, but how is that determined if they're taking too much water? Yeah,
I don't know the details, and that's what the state would do when their hydrogeologist looks at the landscape, the depth of water, the water flow direction, a lot of hydrology work that would look at the quantity, recharge versus removal, and how that might affect adjacent surface water. We don't get into that
You
too
don't
much.
do that, yeah, I was curious about that.
Yeah,
So, question, a number of years ago, I had some springs that had a beginning point and I took water from the beginning point. It was in a gully near ag fields, flowing into said ponds. Anyway, I had that tested up in Colfax. So that test is cheap for nitrates. He said, I talked to the guy after the test, which was high in nitrates. Don't drink it. I said, what about ag chems? And he said, well, about 800 or $1,000 will get you a full down in Ohio, in Iowa. There's a test lab down there. He recommended. I said, well, I'm not going to do that. But I said, can you comment on if there's that much nitrogen in the water, nitrates, is there liable to be ag chems in there? And he said, definitely yes. Would you feel confident guessing the same thing, that in certain areas, like this specific one, is, I think, away from all septic systems by 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet?
Yeah, I think, we always say that, like you mentioned, nitrogen tests, nitrate tests are cheap and easy to test for. And it also should be viewed as an indicator nutrient, meaning that if that is there, what else is with it? Which is kind of leads to the purpose of that EPHT grant, was like, okay, we know that there are elevated levels, let's just see what else is there. And then you can start doing source testing and maybe trying to determine where it is. From a spring, that may have a different outlook on the source of it than, if you were pulling that from a well, just based on depth. I guess it would intrigue me to look closer, for sure.
And I would ask the question, what ag chemicals is he talking about? Part of this study was actually, we did what's called a DAC screen, which is screening for a family of herbicides called triazines. Atrazine is the most commonly known. We had 47 that showed detectable levels of that whole family of compounds, 47 of 973. And they were actually pretty clustered primarily in the towns of Red Cedar and Dunn. Red Cedar, less surprising, Dunn a little bit more so. But it really depends on what exactly ag compounds you're looking for. With the EPHT program that he mentioned, not everybody who had elevated nitrogen had elevated levels of any of the ag compounds they tested for. And they tested for a completely different type of compounds than the DAC screen did in this test. They tested for some of the more commonly used ones.
And I've actually seen it flip too, where the nitrate concentration was safe, but the ag chem was there. So it's yeah.
I have a question on like a housing development where there's wells and septic, well and septic, and is there testing for pharmaceuticals in those wells that are going, passing through the people's septic systems? Is that those pharmaceuticals showing up?
So we didn't test for that.
No.
EPHT grant kind of did, but
Yep, there was some, they were testing for some of the more common ones like heart medication, blood pressure medication, that sort of thing. And none of those were detected in any of the samples from the EPHT grant. Now, that's not to say that that is all conclusive. It was a fairly small scale situation. But there are tests available for certain pharmaceuticals, like those different heart medications, cholesterol, et cetera, But we also, with that, you typically test for things like caffeine, sucralose, and that'll just give you an idea of what's going on and if the septic is even impacting it. Because those are typically going to be found at higher concentrations than pharmaceuticals, because the whole point of pharmaceuticals is for us to take out most of it, which of course there's some that goes, flushes through your body. But there's no mandated testing for, in subdivisions for any sort of pharmaceuticals or anything like that.
I just had a quick question, maybe, that is this something you have to apply for funding every year for, or is it something that is sustainably?
So this is one of the things that goes back to our creative uses of a variety of funds. This was paid for by American Rescue Plan Act funding. So the feds sent down, $4 million. It was a big number to Dunn County, and a lot of it went towards infrastructure, roads, highway department, all that sort of thing. And we were kind of like, hi, can we get some spare change? And they were like, sure. And that was a county board decision. This year, we're using our remainder from last year's funding.
So we had $175,000 last year, and we spent about
140-ish.
Yeah.
We have about $28,000 left for this year from that same funding pool. Next year, we don't know. I have a proposal out to EPA to try and get some money from them. That'd be about $25,000, but it's a nationwide thing and it's fairly competitive. So, here's to hoping. But if we don't have money next year, then we can't do sampling. So
Short answer is no, we don't have sustainable funding.
When we lived in the country, we just ran water out of our faucet and sent it to Colfax. Did you go into wells? Or did you use when you went to somebody's house?
Hunter can
Yeah,
answer
there you go.
this.
All right.
And
So,
if so, was there an average depth? Because you
Yeah.
talked about how it can be different
Yeah.
at the top or the bottom of the well.
so immediately we wouldn't know the average depth of the well, but when we were collecting the samples, we would double check to see if they had some sort of filtration system, reverse osmosis, water softener that would potentially affect the results. And if they did, we would go straight to like the pump almost, like usually
Pressure
down in the
tank.
basement, the pressure tank, yeah.
Right.
And collect straight from there. But
Yeah.
if they didn't have any sort of that filtration system or softener, we could take from like the kitchen sink or a spigot outside. So it really was just a case to case scenario.
So now, if people are encouraged now, so they got tests back from you, I'm hearing Downswell or Colfax to go and get tests. How easy? I live in the city, so I don't have to worry about that. But how easy is it to get tests and to get a spectrum of tests, not just nitrate?
So right now there is a whole myriad of tests available. At the local level, our health department actually keeps kits on hand. They don't have a lab yet. They're in the process of getting a lab, a scaled back lab admittedly, but they're hoping within the next few years that in the government center here in Dunn County, here in Menominee, that you could get a nitrate or a bacteria test at the health department. In the meantime, they do have kits available for the Eau Claire City County Public Health Department, as well as CTL, which is the commercial testing lab up in Colfax. Both of those labs are certified in a whole slew of things. I know both are certified in a whole variety of metals, so arsenic, iron, magnesium, manganese, that whole gamut of things, as well as nitrates, bacteria, the more common things. Once you start getting into the more niche testing, it starts getting a lot more expensive. In order to do a test for like pharmaceuticals or personal care products, I want to say it's about $360 through the lab that we went through last year over in Stevens Point. So depending on what you're looking to test for, there's a lab nearby, but most labs in the state are willing to ship you a kit. And we have, of course, for the more common tests, kits on hand at the government center.
And what's the price tag on, let's say, nitrates and chemicals?
Nitrates by themselves usually run about $25 per lab. So there's a little bit of fluctuation depending on which lab you go to. Ag chemicals, it starts to get a little more hairy. You do DAC screen, for instance, the one that we did. I want to say that is 60-ish. That sound right? By itself through UW Stevens Point. But you start getting into what's called neonics, and that gets a lot more expensive. $300-400. And that's something that we're working with DATCAP on doing with surface water.
Yeah,
I want to say $300-400.
yeah. I think that's kind of why we went with the comprehensive homeowner kit through UW Stevens Point's lab is that they give you your general nitrates, metals, pH, conductivity, all those things, and then they throw in a DAC screen and a whole metals scan on it too. So yeah, and that was about $160, $170. I think the prices may have gone up this year a little bit, but yeah. The one thing that Heather didn't mention, but I can let her talk about is typically with your comprehensive homeowners kit, you would get a bacteria test as well. We chose not to do bacteria primarily because
for our own sanity, there's a really short hold time on bacteria testing. From the time that I would pull it to the time that the lab has to have it fully analyzed is 48 hours. I think, what was your biggest sample collection day? 38 samples?
Mhm.
So in one day, I gave him a list and I said, go forth, Hunter, bring me back 38 bottles. And in one of my first meetings with the lab, they said, please don't make us do that. So that just wasn't going to happen just because of the scale of this. But for individual folks, most labs have the capacity. If you just drop in and say, hi, here's my water sample from the kit that I grabbed at the government center, they can usually run that bacterial screen. They usually just ask, like, please don't drop off your bacteria sample on a Friday afternoon. So, reasonable.
And with bacteria, though, is a sampling method too. Is that there's a flaming of the faucet to make sure you're not, touching the lid. I mean, breathing on it, you can spread bacteria into it. So there's a lot of variables there that we just want to get away from, so we didn't have to deal with that.
We didn't want to set anybody's aerators on fire.
Some aerators are made out of plastic these days too.
Yep, they're very melt prone.
Good question.
Kind of articulated. We have Lake Monroe here. I live on Tamer Lake. Those are fed by the Gay River and Red Sea River, which travels a long way, carries lots of stuff. So, do homes around lakes and stuff and their properties, is there like leaching of nitrates and stuff that are carried by the rivers to the lakes, or is that just not a thing?
So typically it would be the inverse. Generally speaking, groundwater flows towards surface water and it kind of seeps out into the surface water. That's why when it's really, really dry, like the river level will drop, but it doesn't usually get bone dry because there is still some inputs from groundwater. So you're not typically going to be seeing stuff flowing out unless it's a really wet year. You get further up into the Red Cedar system and you'll start seeing more seepage lakes, so more groundwater exchange systems going on. But down here, it's primarily just coming and flowing.
And I would say that one of the things that we could tend to look at would be if you're going to try to assess a watershed, you're going to want to take samples that are closer to that surface water because that's the end of the watershed, right? So if you're going to pull well samples, we would want probably some of the highest participation was around Tater Lake in this program,
Yep.
Which helps give a good picture of kind of what is flowing towards the lake and towards the rivers. And I would say real quick too, just to touch on surface water a little bit. So Tater Monoman, particularly Monoman, there's a gauging or monitoring station just below the dam here in town that's been monitoring this since the 80s, 90s. For the longest time, phosphorus was on the rise. We're actually seeing phosphorus go down now, but we're seeing nitrogen, nitrate going up. So that gives us more concern of like, well, our land use practices and impacts of phosphorus in the system. Hopefully we're maybe turning a corner on that, but we need to double down on how we're managing nitrogen because that is still entering the system and clearly at an exponential rate because it's high. Which I've been told that algae blooms and toxicity of algae blooms are actually higher with higher concentrations of nitrate than they are with phosphorus. Yeah, I think you had it done.
I was wondering if you have any overlap with Stout and some of the research they've been doing for the last few years. What the overlap might be.
Well, so we work with Stout a lot from all kinds of different. So Heather can probably talk a little bit about surface water monitoring. I mean, there's Stout programs that are doing surface water monitoring. We're trying to piggyback with them to make sure we fill in gaps and partner with DNR. We participate through the Lakes REU, the research experience for undergraduates. We help provide feed a lot of information, and frankly, sometimes it's like our ask is like, hey, do you have a group of students that can maybe work on this? And then through the people that organize that group, we can get some research out of it. So yes, we're collaborating quite frequently. When we update land and water resource management plans and some things in the future, we'll be considering a lot of that data. The TMDL, the total maximum daily load plan and assessment for the Red Cedar Basin watershed has some updated numbers in the last 5 or 6 years from Bill James, who works from Stout here. So there's a lot of information that we try to piggyback with.
If I could add to that, about a month ago, as part of our environmental series, we had 2 Stout professors come in and talk about surface water, specifically the Red Cedar watershed. And that video is online, so you can go and check it out at Dragon Tail Books. and see what they said. They were, and they talk all about the testing. In fact, it was almost identical to what you were saying and talking about, except they were just doing surface water instead of the well groundwater. I have a geology question for you. So about where are our wells drawing all the water from? Is there just a single aquifer beneath the surface of the county, or are there different aquifers that we're drawing off of?
So it's kind of like a layer cake. At the top, you have a bunch of rocks and soil and
Right.
hanging out there, and you go down, and then the water starts pooling. And in that area, it's called the unconfined aquifer. Now you keep going down, and you'll hit what's called a confining layer, and that's usually bedrock. You bore through that, and now you're in a different aquifer. And so the further down you go, and you start transitioning between aquifers, most private wells are going to be in that unconfined aquifer layer. Just looking through general records of wells in the county, I've seen wells drilled from 30 feet down to 400 feet. So there's really quite the variety. It just depends on where you are. If you're at the top of a hill, you're probably going to have to go down further. So,
And primarily it's a sandstone aquifer.
Right.
So you're looking at a Water, Jordan Formation type sandstone.
Sure.
In which, I've had over the years, people express to me that, the water we're drinking is Lake Superior water. There's a river under there. And in reality, that's just not how it works. It's pore space in between sand and gravel and between the rock. And the water that falls in the landscape is the water we're drinking. So it doesn't travel, yes. It travels very slow. But we're not drinking Lake Superior water.
Right. When you had talked about the arsenic and the bedrock issues, so we do have wells though that are going into that beneath the bedrock, into the aquifer that's sitting below that. It's not all just what's in the sandstone.
well, and it's some of the wells that we had positive results from. They're just hanging out in that sandstone aquifer. It's just where it is in the flow path, how the water chemistry and oxygen concentrations and all of the different dynamics that are going on within that aquifer. As Chase said, it's moving slowly, but it is moving. And so it really just depends on what the chemistry is doing with the bedrock that's down there. So you can be in that unconfined aquifer and have it be hitting the top of the confining layer
Sure.
and contributing arsenic flowing into it.
And there's also potential correlation to climatic impacts of the groundwater table too. So as water tables drop, boreholes and wells are, maybe if they're not cased all the way down, they're exposed. Then that arsenic can precipitate out, falls into the well and gets pumped back up. If it stays higher water table elevation, that arsenic is a little bit more confined and stays put. It's kind of that fluctuation that can expose some of these other metals and elements to entering our wells and entering the groundwater.
Oxygen does a lot of stuff when it's in water.
Yeah.
You said there were some wells that had concerning levels of such treats, but you should look into it again. Was there any results that you got you should probably stop using that well and found out that they were drinking poison?
Thankfully, no. I can't remember the exact highest amount of arsenic or manganese. Those two are they both have bad outcomes. Arsenic in particular, if you get really high. Thankfully, there was nobody that was in that, rat poison level.
But, from a nitrate standpoint, our messaging was, basically what the Department of Health, has available. And that is, we're fortunate enough to be able to test your water. Here's the results. Here's what it says. In the case of it, it's 40 parts per million nitrate. Just things we said here. Long-term exposure of this is, research is showing is leading to potentially more and more health concerns. But we can't make people not drink it. We provide the information and they have the right to choose how they want to deal with it. I co-chair a statewide committee, land conservation and public health departments have kind of come together and started this little working group committee to look at balancing, some of the public health impacts and land use. You look at your transient non-community wells in the community, your rural bars, your rural churches, campgrounds, things like that. There are requirements for testing those, and if they do test high in elevated levels of contamination, they're required to treat it, drill new wells, or abandon them. Some of those are just not able to afford the repairs or the mitigation. So then we have to look at, okay, how can we either manage the land in a different way? Can we put resources into that watershed that's contributing to that well to help that well out? It's still not going to get immediate safe water. If the goal is to get safe drinking water, then we got to get safe drinking water. We can't rely on a land use change that might take 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years for it to impact. But if we can change the watershed and the land use in a way that it can sustain a healthy level or a safer level in that well, then I think that's where these two parties can have interest in. Hopefully try to come to a resolution. But at this point, based on private well owners, we can't tell them whether they can or can't drink this water.
I suppose to add a little bit more, we can, for in the case of like a 40 nitrate result, we can very, very, very strongly recommend that they do not give that water to infants or pregnant people. But we can't make them do anything. So I would recommend that they stop drinking that right away. Whether or not they do is really up to them though.
And we are, that's part of our partnership with public health too, is like, we said that from the get-go in this project is we have to stay in our lane to some degree. Like, we're land and water conservationists. We're not public health experts. And that's where our public health experts can come in. So if we get results like that, we can connect them with public health. Public health can have that dialogue and probably have more clout in saying and recommending things than a couple people that work with farming and litter and some of the other lake stuff. So
That website, the digital tool you were referring to in terms of showing the results, is that allowed to add other layers like geology or density, vegetation?
Right now, we don't have those other layers in there. It's one of those things, I'm always taking suggestions, but right now it doesn't have those layers in there. But if you go to the other county website, I think right now we're operating through Beacon, you can see a lot of those layers in there, compare and contrast as you go. But yeah, the Beacon site it's where all of your tax parcel data is, but there's also a lot of neat stuff like estimated groundwater elevation or wetlands or things like that. Geology.
We just discovered there's a steep slope layer.
Yeah, about 2 hours ago. So
it would be nice to put those together.
Well, thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was an excellent.
Well, thank you very much. And our next environmental series will be March 14th, where we're going to talk about car-free living. So, but thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Nice to see such a big crowd.